Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Thank you for watching. In this video, I want to take some time to talk about a couple medieval conceptions of human nature. I'd like to focus on the conception of human nature developed by the Islamic philosopher from the 10th and 11th centuries, Avicenna, and then turn my attention to the 13th century Italian Christian philosopher, St. Thomas Aquinas. So let me see if I can do some stage setting and thinking about what's going on in medieval philosophy, just very generally speaking, and then again turn my attention to these important figures from that tradition, from the medieval tradition. So what's going on in medieval philosophy? Well, we know that in broad brushstrokes we have in the medieval period a ton of theologians. So there's the different theistic traditions that develop in Europe, in the Middle East, for example, and the theologians correspond to the Jewish, the Christian, and the Islamic traditions. And so medieval philosophy is very often involves developing theologies and developing philosophies that correspond to the theological traditions in a way that involves bringing in some of the ideas, some of the arguments, some of the conceptual frameworks from the ancient period, and in particular, key ancient Greek figures who the medieval theologians used to develop philosophies and theologies are Plato and Aristotle. So what's going on in the medieval period? Well, there's a lot, but one general thing that we can say that characterizes a lot of it is the effort to harmonize the theologies from the relevant theological traditions with Plato and or Aristotle. So different philosophers are going to relate to these different Greek thinkers and in different ways. And so some of the medieval philosophers, they incline more toward a Platonic worldview, and others incline more toward an Aristotelian one. There's a lot more than that going on, but that's just really a rough sketch of trying to capture what's going on in the medieval period. And so let's maybe just recap Plato and Aristotle, a couple of their ideas. I have other videos on Plato and Aristotle that you can watch if you want to know a bit more than just the recap I'm going to give of their theories of human nature. So Plato has a view that's sometimes called substance dualism. So we are bodies and we are souls. We have bodies and souls. So there's two aspects to human beings. Human nature consists of having bodies and having souls. Now here's what Plato thinks. We are essentially souls. So we are essentially an immaterial substance that has the ability to survive bodily death in this life. Our bodies then turn out to be contingent. We may naturally exist in bodies, but our bodies are contingently related to what we are. So this view is sometimes called substance dualism, and he thinks that our minds and our bodies interact with each other in a causal kind of way. Now, the Aristotelian view is also dualistic, but it's not substance dualistic. It's maybe we can call it Aristotelian dualism, because what he thinks is that we are essentially composites of form and matter, where the form is to be understood as the human soul, and of course matter is the bodily part of us. And so for Aristotle, he thinks that we have bodies, and our bodies are organized by a form, and that's what our soul is. So the human form, the human soul, ultimately for Aristotle, ends up being rationality. So according to Aristotle, all living things, whether we're talking about plants, animals, or human beings, they have a form-matter component. They are form-matter composites. What distinguishes the plants from the animals from the human beings is the kind of soul that organizes the matter in question. So human beings have a form or a soul that's different from that of the other kinds of living things. And again, that form is rationality, reason. So it's important to note that this form is an organizational or unifying principle of the material that makes up the living thing in question. It's not a substance. So it's not to be understood as a thing that can exist on its own. It's always connected to, informing, providing unity to matter. Okay, so that's Platonic substance dualism, and then there's Aristotelian dualism. And philosophers during the medieval era, in the theological traditions, try to develop theories of human nature. And some of the philosophers, as I mentioned, incline toward a more Platonic conception. In this case of human nature, some incline more toward an Aristotelian conception of human nature. Okay, so let's turn to Avicenna. Avicenna gives us a very, very famous thought experiment to help give us an argument for his conception of the human being. Now, his conception of the human being inclines toward some kind of dualism. Now, we don't need to settle which kind it is, okay, but he does argue for a kind of dualism, and he does so in response to those who would maintain that we are purely physical things. Okay, so there were philosophers in Avicenna's time who were trying to argue that we were physical things. And so Avicenna, in response to them, in a work called On the Soul, develops a thought experiment involving the flying man, as it's sometimes called, or sometimes called the floating man. And this thought experiment gives rise to an argument against those who would be physicalists about human nature. How does the thought experiment go? Well, here's how it goes. Avicenna says in his work called On the Soul, or On Psychology, sometimes it's called, we say, if a human is created all at once, created with his limbs, separated as he does not see them, and if it happens that he does not touch them, and they do not touch each other, and he hears no sound, he would be ignorant of the existence of the whole of his organs, but would know the existence of his individual being as one thing, while being ignorant of all the former things. Okay. Ignorant of all the bodily things. Okay, so what's going on in this thought experiment? Maybe we can just add a little bit, okay, to what's going on here. Imagine God, an all-powerful being, having the ability to, out of thin air, as it were, from nothing, create a human being. And the human being is just suspended in the air, floating, as it were. Okay, you might imagine that the limbs are just kind of hanging outward, and we're supposed to imagine that all of our senses are basically turned off and inactive for a time. At least for time thinking about this thought experiment. The idea is supposed to be that we're an all-powerful being. Of course God could do such a thing. Now, if our senses are turned off, then we'd have no awareness of our body, because the way in which we're aware of our bodies, the argument would go, would be through the use of our senses. Okay, but our senses are, again, inactive. But here's what Avicenna says. Avicenna says that in this case, we would be aware of ourselves. Okay? So, again, the thought experiment, God just creates us. Our senses are turned off. Okay, so we have no way of being aware that we have a body, but we'd be aware of ourselves as existing. So then he says that given that we'd be aware of ourselves as existing in this situation, we're not our bodies. If we're not our bodies, then guess what? Yep, we're something immaterial. Okay, we're something immaterial. So his conception of human nature is that the human being is essentially an immaterial entity of some kind. Okay, so we see how the thought experiment is supposed to give rise to the argument. Okay, now if you don't have the immediate judgment that you would be aware of yourself in this kind of situation, well then you're likely not to accept his conclusion. Okay, but the argument does rely on, given as a thought experiment, or is derived from a thought experiment, it does really rely on having that immediate judgment that, yeah, you would be aware of yourself in this kind of case. So what kind of argument are we able to extrapolate from this flying man case? Well, I've kind of already noted, but let's maybe see if we can be a bit more careful about it. Step 1, I'm aware of myself existing in the flying man scenario. Step 2, I'm not aware of my body existing in the flying man scenario. And then step 3, if I'm not aware of my body existing in the flying man scenario, then I'm not my body. Like, full stop, I'm not my body at all. Because if I were my body, the argument would go, then I'd be aware of it in the flying man scenario. Okay, and the idea there is supposed to be because you are aware of yourself. And so from steps 2 and 3, we can conclude, so I'm not my body. And then from there, it's just a really short hop, skip, and a jump to the conclusion that we're not anything bodily, we're something immaterial. Okay, so that's really the significance of the floating or the flying man argument that I wanted to develop. There are other important aspects of it involving self-awareness, being such that our nature is such that we are, at the very least, implicitly self-aware of ourselves. But let's not lock in on that. I really wanted to lock in on this immateriality aspect that Avicenna develops. Now, he develops this idea that human nature is immaterial. This certainly connects up with ancient Greek thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, who also argue that there's a sense in which we are immaterial, either an immaterial soul or an immaterial substance soul, as Plato thought, or an immaterial thing, as in the form of our bodies. Okay, let's now turn for a few minutes and focus on thinker St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas, again, 13th century Italian Christian philosopher, he's someone who epitomizes an Aristotelian thinker. Now, he was influenced in part by some of the ideas from the ancient thinker Plato, but he was most deeply influenced by Aristotle. And so when Aristotle develops his theory of human nature, he's developing a Christian view of human nature that's distinct from a Platonic Christian conception of human nature. So how does St. Thomas Aquinas then view human nature? Well, almost exactly the way that Aristotle did. So remember, Aristotle thinks that human beings are composites of form and matter, that we have matter and we have a form. The form is what makes us ultimately human beings, because the form, it just is what our soul is. So when we ask the question, when Aquinas asks the question, what is it to be a human being? He says, well, it's to be a material object with a form, with a soul, and the soul is the form of the body. So he's going to reject the idea that we get from Plato that we are a substance soul. Rather, we are essentially a composite of form and matter. Now, what's interesting about St. Thomas Aquinas' view, or one of the interesting things I should say about St. Thomas Aquinas' view, is that he thinks that there is a sense in which the soul, the form of the body, remember, can exist independently of the body. So this is supposed to be an interesting idea, because we go back to Aristotle's conception of human nature. We are essentially a composite of form and matter. If you take this Aristotelian idea and you develop it in the context of a Christian theology, you have to give some kind of account of how it is that human beings can survive death, given that the body seems to die. Well, where does the soul go if we are essentially a composite of form and matter? Shouldn't the soul die also when the body does, on an Aristotelian conception of human nature? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas, being a Christian theologian, wants to try to provide an account of how it is that we can have an afterlife despite the fact that we are essentially composites of form and matter. Well, he thinks that the body dies. He thinks that the soul can exist for a time. So this is Aquinas' view. The soul can exist for a time on its own in a kind of metaphysically defunct way. So there it is existing, and it basically exists as the individual in question awaits judgment for its eternal career, as it were. So if we end up going to heaven, then the body reunites with the soul, and the soul goes heaven, and the soul and body go heavenward. And then if we go to hell on the Christian conception, then the body reunites with the soul, and the soul goes downward to hell. And so that's St. Thomas Aquinas' view. And there's tension in the view, because he wants at one and the same time to be Aristotelian, but then also be a Christian and say that the soul can survive death. The soul can exist for a time while it awaits the body for its resurrection thereafter. So that's all I have to say on medieval conceptions of human nature, thinking about the conceptions developed by Avicenna and St. Thomas Aquinas. Thank you for watching, everybody. If you have any questions, please email me at jedickin@syr.edu. Thanks again. Bye-bye.